inside scoop as it's been billed on what's going on with our pensions. So I think without further ado, Mark, we'll hand over to you. Can I also just remind people to keep cameras and microphones off when they're not speaking, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Mark Taylor-Batty. In my day job, I'm a theatre and performance and deputy head of the School of English at the University of Leeds. But yeah, I'm here in my capacity as one of the JNC, the Joint Negotiating Committee, that is negotiators on behalf of the UCU and elected by the UCU. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got some slides. I think the only way of going through some of the detail here, and it's very, very kind of complicated and difficult detail, is to go through with some slides and some illustrations. And what I want to do is to look back a little bit on the changes to the pension that have came into force in April this year, a little bit of a history around that, but also actually to demonstrate, to show you what the impact on your pension has been as a result of that, and to look at where the pension fund is now in terms of deficits. But also I want to talk a little bit about the LDI crisis that hit a couple of weeks ago with the Bank of England putting up lots of money to buy bonds to try and sort out the pensions issue, and how that impacted on direct defined benefit pensions, and specifically, of course, how it impacted, if at all, on USS, in case people were worried about that. So I'm going to share my screen and go through those slides. I intend to speak for about 20 minutes, unless I'm asked to stop, and then I'll take questions. Okay, hopefully you should now see my slides in front of you. I'm going to take that as read, but do shout if you can't see them. So all of this began with the 2020 valuation. As you'll remember, the USS insisted upon putting together valuation in the middle of the COVID economic crisis, when there was a huge crash in the value of assets. Many of you will have seen this graph before. I just want to speak to it very briefly. So this is looking at the prudent assumptions that were made by USS in the course of a number of valuations. So the valuation is something that has to happen by law every 3 years to define benefit schemes. And the point of evaluation is to see whether or not the scheme is in surplus or deficit. And that is defined in very, very broad terms. But to put it simply, is to say, does the scheme have enough money in its funds to pay for all the pensions that are guaranteed, that have been promised? If it doesn't have enough, there's a deficit. If it has more than enough, there's a surplus. But UCU have been very critical of that, and indeed UUK, the employers, have been critical of the manner in which this valuation has been carried out. And it certainly didn't help that it was carried out, or the last one was carried out at the time of the economic crash after COVID hit back in 2020. So what are these lines showing? These lines in front of you. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if I just start with the dashed pink or peach line, the 2011 prudent assumptions. This goes back to the 2011 valuation, when if you look at the thick black line, that's the actual value of the USS funds. That's how much money was in the bank, as it were, or in investments, to be more accurate. So it was just shy of 40 billion back in 2011, and they projected that it would grow along that pink dotted line. That is to say, it would not reach 90 billion until around 2035. But it topped 92 billion earlier this year. So that prediction was wrong. If you look at all the others to the right of that, they seem to be getting more and more prudent over the years. So they're projecting that the funds won't grow as fast as they have indeed grown. If you look then at the bottom line, that kind of rose red 2020 prudent assumptions, the ones that were voted for by UUK back in August, it shows that they were predicting that the funds would not grow from then just under 70 billion, would not grow to 90 billion until sometime in the next century. So that's a very, very big margin of error, given that they grew to 92 billion earlier this year. The thick red line, this graph was prepared around about the time of the demand that UCU was making for a 2021 replacement evaluation, just as they replaced the 2017 with the 2018 valuation, some of you may recall. And then they prepared some proposals, they prepared some assumptions that were even more prudent. and that seemed to indicate that they expected the fund to decline in value, never to reach the heights at which it has subsequently reached. So there's a lot to unpack there, but what I'm showing you is one of the reasons why we have had cuts to our pensions over the years is because the valuations have always assumed much lower growth than has in fact been achieved by the fund managers within USS. The fund probably sits somewhere between 80 and 90 billion right now as I speak. I don't know the precise figure. Obviously that changes over the months. What happened to our pensions then earlier in April? You'll have felt the impact in your salary packet, but you'll have seen that you're paying more out for your pension. You pay 9.8% now. You used to pay 9.6%. The employer pays a little bit more as well. I want to look at those changes to benefits, but more importantly, a lot of people get these figures and don't really know what exactly they mean, what the implication is. So I want to illustrate what that might mean to a typical person. But let me go through the changes that were affected in April. So instead of getting 175th accrual to your pension every year, you now get 185th. I'll demonstrate that. I'll illustrate that in a minute. The DC threshold was reduced from shy of £60,000 salary to now £40,000 salary. That is to say that everything you pay in to your pension, everything you pay in from your salary up to £40,000 of your salary goes into your defined benefit pension. Everything above that goes into your defined contribution pension. A defined benefit pension is quite simply your benefits defined. You can calculate in advance what pension you will receive when you retire. The benefit is guaranteed and knowable. In a defined contribution pension, of course, all you know is what you're putting in, what you're paying in. The contribution is defined and nothing else. In this case, it's defined at 9.8% above £40,000, just as it is below. The threshold, now the £40,000 threshold salary, will increase with inflation. It says up to 10% here. That's not quite accurate, and I've changed that in following slides to be more accurate. But now it only increases with inflation up to 2.5%. I'll talk a little bit about that again on the coming slides. That 2.5% has not been implemented, even though it was part of the April changes. It's been put on hold till I think 2024, but nonetheless, it is one of the changes that has come in. Let me now just look at those things and talk about those changes and the impact they have on you. I haven't mentioned the accrued benefits, but I will demonstrate that. So if we look at this very crudely, what I'm going to do is demonstrate just by looking at that. So before the 1st of April, in the first year that you joined a USS salary, you would put aside 1/75th of your salary. That would become then your guaranteed pension in retirement. So if you only worked for 1 year at a USS institution, you would have 1/75th of your salary as your pension, and you would get that every year in your retirement. Okay, so if you obviously you're going to work for more than 1 year in most cases. So in the second year, you would have another lump sum. So that would you double your amount of pension in retirement. This is your annual pension in retirement. So it's only small amounts now, but the more you add, obviously, the higher your pension becomes. But you're only adding that in until up to the DC threshold. So you're only gaining these benefits, this guaranteed pension, up to the defined contribution threshold, which was around £60,000. Any salary you earned over that, and there's a minority of people earning over that, that was going into a defined contribution scheme, which was just, as I said, you know how much goes in, you don't know how much you might get out from it. But then, of course, a little bit of money is added to the first year because the benefits have accrued, that you've accrued and put aside, are increased with inflation in the background. Now, what actually happened, what we had was a soft cap. So they increased with inflation up to 5%. If inflation went over 5%, that then increased to the amount was halved by up to 10%. So if inflation went to 10%, the increase in the background would only be by 7.5%. That is to say, if inflation went over 5%, our pensions accrued and growing in the background did not grow in line with inflation. They became worth less in terms of what they could buy at retirement. As we know, inflation now currently stands at 9.9%. So this soft cap, which is currently still in place, as we put a hold on the change to this, will now take effect. So the September inflation effect will be used for the accrual rate for this year. So we've already seen a cut to that accrual before we've even had the changes. So year 3, you add another amount, you're tripling the amount you're having, but also you're seeing this accrual. You're seeing this accrual in line with inflation going on, and that goes on throughout. So you're building up this pension pot, and the amount that you put aside is increasing in relation to inflation. But as soon as inflation gets over 5%, you're no longer keeping up. Your money can no longer buy what it could have done at the point at which you were putting it away in relation to the year at which you put it away. I hope that's clear. So I'm trying to show now how the pension is built up, the defined benefit pension is built up, and what the impacts are to that in terms of the changes. So after April, we're now putting away 1/85th each year instead of 1/75th. And so that means we're putting away a smaller pension every year than we were before. And we're paying more for it. Instead of paying 9.6, we're now paying 9.8 for that smaller pension. We're also putting less into defined benefits because the DC threshold is now at £40,000. So earning over £40,000, all the money above £40,000, your contributions above £40,000 are going into a defined contribution pension. And anybody who has this DC part of their pension has checked their statements recently. The 2022 statements have come out in the last couple of weeks for many people. Many people will have seen that DC amount go down compared to last year, despite the additional contributions going in because of the way in which it's been invested. That's a whole new different story, and I'm not going to get involved on that in great detail now. But of course, the accrual, the plan is to decrease the accrual against inflation, so that you only increase in the background against inflation up to 2.5%. Any inflation over 2.5%, then your pension is not keeping up with costs. So why is this? Why are we paying more to get so much less? Why was this pushed through? Well, that's because they need to pay deficit recovery payments to pay for that deficit that was calculated during the COVID economic crisis. And that means that every one of us is now paying 6.2%, or the pension contributions that we are paying, 6.2% of our salary is going towards deficit recovery payments. And that means, because that money has to go to recover the deficit, less pension. But we know the deficit doesn't exist anymore. I'll come to that in a minute. I just want to show you comparative pensions. This was something that was put together earlier this year, I think, by my colleague Jackie on JNC. So this compares the annual pension and retirement for 1 year's contribution across different schemes. So the USS before they were cut is the blue line going along the middle. So this is assuming CPI inflation stays steady at 2.5%. And you can see along the bottom is the age in the future to person who is 40 years old today. So it's based on a 40K being earned by a 40-year-old. And you can see that the TPA, the teacher's pension, is doing quite well at the moment compared to every other pension. And that is the pension scheme, of course, that our colleagues in the so-called new universities have, as well as teachers more broadly. But if you compare what's happened to us now, it's worse than it was before. It's worse than local government payments, and it's worse than TPA. It's half as much as TPA, and that's astonishing and outrageous in and of itself. Okay, what does this mean for Open University as an example? So in 2022 to 23, the payments in pension, the reduction in your pension collectively is about 19.7 million. And that's the loss in pension in today's money from just 1 year of working due to the cuts that the UUK pushed through onto our pensions, and which I've demonstrated how those cuts work, and the fact that comes about because we have to pay, or the universities collectively have agreed to pay 6.2% contributions towards deficit recovery payments. Right, where have we got to since that was pushed through? Looking at the March 2022 monitoring position, so every month the USS pension scheme does a monitoring position. It checks where we are against the valuation. So these monitoring positions are not as detailed as valuations, but they're measuring where the scheme stands. And what we discovered from the March monitoring position was that the cost of the UK changes would only have been 24.4% of pension at that point. That is to say that we would have needed to pay 8.1% of salary rather than 9.8 in order to get the benefits that they had cut. So down to the level of the benefits as cut, down from what it was before. And yet we're still paying the 9.8 for those reduced pensions. That's because the deficit recovery payments would be around 0%. There is no deficit to pay according to the monitoring position. And yet the universities have agreed to pay 6.2% this year and next year, because they would not listen to any of the arguments made by UCU that this was clearly around the corner. Given that a new recovery ban is possible, it is possible to replace the agreement that was made earlier this year. It does not require a new valuation. And the JNC could resolve, if it came together, to have a retroactive restoration of benefits. Everything that was cut on the 1st of April. That is possible based on the monetary positions that we have seen. Just let me go on and look a little bit further at that. Looking then at the June monetary position, that consolidated that. That continues to provide evidence. So here is a chart that's been provided, and this shows the deficit and the funding ratio of, estimated from USS financial monitoring. So the orange bars going down, or indeed going up at the end, are the deficits that have been calculated by the USS over time since 2018. At the end there, we can see there is a surplus of 1.8 billion. So there's this huge swing, and the 14.1 in the middle is, of course, the decision that they made to do the valuation in the middle of the COVID economic crisis. Remove that and you would have a much smoother curve going down and back up again. So this is the cost of the benefits as they have now happened. Let's move on and let's do the same calculations, but removing those changes to benefits. So if we hadn't changed benefits, if we were still earning the benefits we had before April and paying at the level we were paying, this is what would have happened. We would still have 100% funding. We would have no deficit. This is based on USS figures, financial monitoring figures for June 2022. So let me make it clear and let me not mince my words. Anybody who tries to explain that the reason that the USS funding situation is in a better situation because of the benefit cuts is either lying or, more likely, simply does not understand the maths, does not understand the statistics. If you look at these two, the changes that the benefits made are insignificant almost. The changes the benefits have made a small dip, if you like, in one way. The improvement is simply to do with market conditions and the improvement in market and the ongoing improvement in some quarters of market conditions. So please don't be bought in by this line that's going around some UK universities. Many have stopped using it, but some are still saying the improvement in the position is to do with the benefit cuts. It is not. It's made a mild difference, but not a huge difference. Here we can see it's 2% of the funding ratio. Okay, moving on. How much time have I got? I'll just speak another 5 minutes because people might want to hear a little bit about the LDI crisis and the impact on USS. So the LDI crisis, LDIs are liability-driven investments. And this relates to that process of de-risking that you may have heard about in relation to the USS pension since 2014. De-risking is an approach that involves moving to match your liabilities. So that is the amount of money that you have already guaranteed will go out in pensions at some point in the future. And you match that with long-term investment vehicles, which give you return rates. You know the rate of return that you will get from those, so bonds and gilts. You don't know the rate of return you're going to get from investing in the market, but you do know the rate you're going to get from these. But the rate that you get from these is much lower than a typical return from the market over a long-term period. So usually you only de-risk your own personal pension portfolio in the 5 or maybe 10 years running up to the time at which you would retire, because you don't want market volatility in the last few years of your work to affect the pension you're going to get. That's when de-risking is usually talked about. But here what we've seen is the attempt to increase the amount of low yield vehicles such as rates within the USS portfolio at the expense of selling off high yield vehicles that would have increased the amount of money over the long term that the pension could have benefited from. But the problem with this is, of course, that you need then, you've got to, what happens if the rates on the yields go down? What if the gilts, the amount comes in that you're no longer covering the promised pensions if you're using these vehicles? Then you have to start hedging against that, don't you? You start using vehicles that will leverage your positions so that you don't lose anything. But if then the rates go up suddenly and quickly, you've got to cover that position. You've got obligations that you've got to pay for, and you've got to pay for them as quickly as you can. This is what happened to pension schemes a couple of weeks ago. And the quickest way of getting money out to fulfill your obligations, because the rates are going up when you've hedged against them going down, is to sell the gilts. The gilts are the quickest thing that you can get out. And of course, they were selling gilts so quickly that the price of those gilts went down. And because they were going down, they needed to sell more of them because they weren't getting the money for them that they needed to cover their obligations. That created a downward spiral. The Bank of England had to intervene by buying bonds to artificially inflate the price a little bit, and that balanced the books a little bit more. That helped things get in place. Now, when the USS, Bill Gavin at USS, earlier this year wanted to increase the amount of liability-driven investment that impacted within the USS portfolio, there was a lot of argument against it from UCU, but also within the UK. And famously, there was this letter from Cambridge, Oxford, and Imperial in February 2020 saying that the increase in leverage might introduce potentially significant risks into the scheme in a period of high market volatility. Well, they got that right. And we've seen that high volatility, and we know that USS had to do something to cover the obligations that had been created by increasing their exposure through liability-driven investment strategies. This is all very complicated. I'm trying to sum it up in as simple English as I possibly can. I hope that makes sense. But let me just quickly look at some of what USS have said in relation to that in the last couple of weeks. So in a public statement on the 28th of September, they said, from an investment perspective, we have a large and experienced in-house team, which means we can be very responsive and react quickly. We were and remain very well collateralized. This seems to indicate that they haven't lost so much money that it causes damage. They remain very well collateralized. How much is that? We don't know. We don't yet know how much they've spent, how much they had to throw overboard, as it were, to fulfill their obligations. In a statement to the heads of institutions, so your VC will have got this, USS were not under the same degree of pressure that some schemes will have experienced. As an open defined benefit scheme, we are relatively immature. Others, more mature schemes, will have relatively high levels of liability matching in place. Just let me explain that terminology. We are an immature scheme. That means, and we'll get their pensions out later. A mature scheme is a scheme that is closed to people paying in, and it's just paying out pensions over time. And of course, those schemes need to guarantee those pensions much more heavily than a scheme where the money is still flowing in. In fact, in our scheme, more money is coming in every year from our contributions and our university's contributions than is going out in the pensions that is paid. So every year more money comes in than goes out. That increases the value of the fund, and there's no sign of that changing. So in an immature scheme, you've got a very different set of things going on. They also said in that same statement to VCs, the market reaction to the government's mini budget has seen very significant increases in long-term interest rates and a particular pressure on index-linked government debt. Should these moves be sustained, then all things being equal, they have a beneficial effect on scheme funding and the cost of future service in schemes like USS. That's important because what that means is because though the price of gilts was going down, the interest rate on gilts was going up. And because we know that they peg their valuation so heavily against the cost of gilts, against the value of gilts, the accrual that you can get from gilts, rather than from market assets which are actually in the portfolio, as those rates go up, then we're pushing and pushing further into surplus in terms of the way in which they do their valuation. Okay, so I'm going to close that down now. I've talked for quite a bit now, maybe a bit too much, but I'm happy to take any questions on any of that detail if that's welcome, and that can be done through the chat or in any other way. Or if we haven't got time, I'm happy just to say thank you, goodbye.
Well, I think we do have a few minutes, so maybe can I ask people to put hands up, or as Mark said, put your question in the chat and we'll try and see if we can get it answered. While you're doing, while you're actually putting hands up, I've got a question of my own, which is, I understand that Cambridge University has had their actuaries looking at the position and has said, and has actually said to their staff that they are confident that benefits could be restored, and the scheme could still be in surplus. Are you hearing anything from your various contacts about other universities also taking that position?
I haven't. No, I mean that is perhaps the most well-known public position, and it's repeating what we have been saying through what we've seen in the stats and what I've shown today, directly from the monitoring positions. But I think they're the only university that's actually had an actuary look at that information and put out that kind of statement. If other universities have had actuaries look at it, I'm not aware of them making a statement that has been allowed to go public.
Thanks. Well, we'll hope more will join with them. For those who want to know about the Open Universities position, there was a recent pension forum, which is the unions and management side getting together to discuss. And we pressed quite hard for a view from the university, asking them to look at making a priority of restoration of benefits. And they said that the position was still quite complicated and everything was quite volatile, and they weren't in a position to be able to say anything about that at this time, which is very disappointing, but we will continue to press. We've got a question in the chat. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying it's a typical holding position. They don't quite know yet, so they're waiting to get more collective intelligence together. So there's a question in the chat about why don't we bin off USS and join TP? We can't do that. If we're in an institution that provides a USS pension, then we're in that. If you want to join the teacher's pension, you need to go and work at a university that offers that as part of that scheme. So the universities are committed to these schemes and can't easily pull out. In fact, the ability to pull out has become more difficult in the last year. Is the USS, sorry, go on.
Well, we have somebody with a hand up, so I don't know if Les wants to go ahead, and then we'll come back to the chat pane.
Is that me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, yeah, thanks for the presentation. You fit a lot into a short time. When the dispute began, many members were baffled at how, or even whether, the USS experts were truly wrong. And after all this time, they've been consistently wrong in a particular direction, being wrong. And I wonder, what's your sense of how this can be explained? Because many people would like to believe that the experts are perhaps incompetent or less than fully qualified, but, and this relates to the research that many of us have been doing for a long time, that there is no such thing as neutral expertise. It always serves a particular policy and even a worldview. It's that in that direction. Yes?
I think see there's two sides to the USS. There's the investing side, and they're doing a good job. You can see that the money going up. You can see the value of the fund going up, and the investments working very well. And then, of course, there are the people that have to put together these valuations, and they are competent. They do know what they're doing, but what they're pushing is an increased amount of prudence. So in order to guess the future, in order to guess how well the fund will grow, they're using very, very prudent, in other words, very pessimistic views of how things. Yes, so assuming that salaries will go up at a much higher rate than any employer is ever going to agree to, they're assuming that the market won't succeed as much as it has done historically by quite a large figure. They seem to peg the increase of the funds against the value of gilts, as I said earlier, rather than against the whole balanced portfolio, which includes, assets on the stock market and not just gilts. But they seem to peg it only against gilts, and they've traditionally in the last 10 years been very, very low. The fact that they are going up now is in our favour, given that they use that valuation methodology. But what we've seen is an increased, what we've called excessive prudence. So the prudence, and that was part of the point of showing you the first graph, the prudence seems to have just got ratcheted up more and more and more over the years. So they're getting more and more pessimistic about how things will grow. And that's, the valuation, the deficit is not a possible, there's not an account somewhere that's missing money. It's a fictional kind of construction of what might happen in the future.
You might say that their normative view about prudence, just by coincidence, matches the USS policy of what should be done.
Well, absolutely, yeah. So there are specific narratives, it seems to me, that dominate, that are very difficult to breach, to try and argue against.
So I think we're going to have to wind that part of the discussion up, but
Sure.
we do have one final question. If you'd like to give us a view, what do you think is going to happen to USS over the next 6 months? And is the threat of strike action going to shift the UK position possibly?
Yeah, and the threat of strike action always has an impact. We should remember, let's not forget that strike action and the threat of strike action is both a literal and a figurative thing, if I can put it in those terms. There are literal impacts of strike action, but also figurative. We have, if you like, an impact. The threat of doing something has an impact before the actual doing of that thing. Of course, we can't strike against USS, but striking against UK can help us to put pressure on them to follow the narratives, or to follow the narratives that UCU are trying to promote, but also to have dialogue with UCU, to be open to this argument that we need to go into JNC and to put together a package of recovery of benefits. And it would be great to do that before the next valuation next year. Certainly, it should be possible to do it on the back of that next valuation, depending on how much extra prudence gets thrown into the bin. So I think, I'm mildly optimistic. Certainly, the LDI crisis has thrown a spanner in that bucket. I don't think, the USS, what the USS is saying is it hasn't impacted massively, and in many ways it's positive, that we will see the gilts price going up, and that will bring us further into surplus. What we don't know yet is how much money they threw in. We don't know yet the amount of money it's cost USS and how they will, cover that collateral.
Oh, well, thanks very much. And of course, it's worth remembering, everyone, that that we still have a defined benefit scheme, because in 2018, we flatly refused to accept that we would lose our guaranteed benefits. And that was the push from UK at the time. They said it wasn't possibly affordable to continue having defined benefits. And as Mark's graphs very clearly showed us, that was absolutely, totally 100% wrong. Yeah. So, and if anyone is still in USS, as many of us are, over that time, we have actually made up far more than we lost through that strike action. So it's worth remembering.
That's a very important point. If anyone says strike action doesn't do anything, we are all measurably better off as a consequence of the 2018 outcome and the retention of defined benefits. Measurably better off. So, of course it's done. We need to go back in. We need to have that leverage in order to get a better result this time. And of course, we on the GNC are continuing to work on that.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you for all your efforts as a negotiator. And of course, we always hope that with a strong strike vote, we can give strength to negotiations such that we won't actually need to go on strike this time. That's the hope that we always have. Thank you so much, Mark. I can see from the chat, many people have really appreciated your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
So we've got limited time, and that means that that we've had to cut that a bit short, but we're delighted to welcome our second speaker today, who is Robyn Orfitelli of Sheffield University UCU, and who is one of the lead negotiators. You remember that there's a separate body that we negotiate with on pay, and we do that in association with 4 other unions as well. So Robyn is going to take us through the pay claim, which is not just about pay, but a whole bunch of other issues as well, all tied together. Robyn, I see that you're on the call, so I'm going to hand over to you, if that's all right.
Absolutely. Caitlin, can you hear and see me okay? Everything is good?
Absolutely brilliant. Carry on.
Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for having me. As Caitlin said, I'm Robyn Orfitelli. I'm from the University of Sheffield, and I've been one of the pay negotiators on GINCHs since 2019. So I'm going to try to make this as fast as possible, my presentation, because I want to get to questions as fast as I possibly can, because those are more important. But yeah, as Caitlin said, it works slightly differently with the GINCHs negotiation. That stands for Joint Negotiation. Joint Negotiating. Oh, I can never remember this. This is very embarrassing. I don't remember the C stand. Committee for Higher Education Sector. There we go. Joint Negotiating Committee for the Higher Education Sector. It's always the C that messes me up. And this has 5 unions in it: UCU, Unison, Unite, EIS, and GMB. And every single year, round about February or the beginning of March, we submit a claim to the employers' representatives, the Universities and Colleges Employers Association, commonly referred to as UCEA, who represent all of the employers in the sector. It's a subscriber body, so people can, individual employers can opt in, but it very much benefits employers to opt in, so the vast majority of them do. There are a lot of items that go into the pay claim, a lot of headline items, but there are probably two that are most relevant to UCU members. But there are a couple of others I'll mention as well. The first one is a pay rise in line with inflation. And in fact, this year we've asked for inflation, and RPI is the measure that all of the 5 joint trade unions use. And in fact, every trade union in the UK uses, plus 1%. So this is keeping in line with a sort of keep up and catch up policy, because by whichever inflation metric you use, pay has declined in real terms over the last 20 years in the higher education sector, somewhat shockingly, to the point where some of the lowest points on our consolidated pay spine have had to be cut off because they have dropped below the living wage. And this is because pay has been eroded so profusely. And we normally ask for more than just inflation plus 1% to try to get this catch up, but given just how shockingly inflation had risen this year, and this was clear even as early as February, the unions jointly decided to ask for inflation plus 1%. You'll be aware that the employer's body has not offered this. In fact, as inflation rises ever higher, past double digits, their offer is somewhere between 7 and 10% less than inflation, depending on which metric you use. The other major item that the unions have asked for, that is a huge deal for UCU members, is a framework which brings negotiations over working conditions into sector-wide bargaining. So right now, the employers have a very hardline position that sector-wide bargaining is only over pay, and that things like job security, workload, and pay equality cannot be part of sector-wide bargaining. This is a demand that the unions have, is to bring this in so that we can have sector-wide baseline standards for employment, so that an employee moving from institution to institution doesn't have to wonder how their terms and conditions are going to change on a sort of big picture level, that there will be some sort of baseline standards that we just as a sector know this is how we treat employees, we will stick to these. If anyone's here from other unions, there are a couple of other things to quickly mention. One headline item is a minimum wage of at least £10 per hour for all. There's a sense in which it's really sad that this has to be a claim here, but there are institutions where effectively this is not the case. There is not a 10-hour pound per hour wage for all. And for all institutions to be sort of come back to a 35-hour work week, as opposed to many which have 37. And we know that whatever the notional work week is, many of us are working more hours than this. So why are these two things incredibly important? So I've hinted at one, bringing the negotiating working conditions within the sector-wide negotiating framework just makes the sector healthier as a whole. This doesn't just benefit us as employees, this benefits employers. And it doesn't have to mean that employers and individual union branches have no autonomy. The way that these baseline standards get implemented locally would have to take into account certain local parameters, and this is exactly captured within the framework and the headline demands that we've been trying to push with UCEA. But it's also important because as the sector goes more and more into crisis, we're seeing people leaving the sector. We are seeing long-standing employees leave. We're seeing graduate students who are unwilling to enter the sector. We're seeing professional services staff leave en masse I mean, there are so many industry jobs, there are so many better supported and better paying jobs. We are seeing a lot of expertise leaving this sector, and it is rapidly coming to a crisis, and it's only going to increase if we can't bring better, healthier working conditions into the sector. We know it's possible to do this. We can look across the sector and see that even with several years of pandemic, even with several years of uncertainty brought in by various general elections, by various new policies, that the sector as a whole is in surplus. We can also see when we look at individual institutions that many individual institutions, in fact, most, are still in surplus. And importantly, those institutions which aren't in surplus, when you look at the finances, what you see is that this is due to risky strategic investments. This is due to over capital spending, so risky capital expenditure, and that's the sort of financial way of saying fancy buildings. It's due to risky investments in overseas campuses. We're seeing this across the sector happening, and these aren't just risky investments, they also raise serious equalities concerns in some cases. And we're also seeing a really worrying trend within staff expenditure, which is that not only is staff expenditure sort of falling overall across the sector and at the vast majority of institutions individually, but within the basket of staff expenditure, there is a shift into who's getting the money. So high earners, these are traditionally defined as people who earn 100K or more per year. But given inflation, it might actually be better to just sort of define these as perhaps the top 50 or 100 earners at a university. The amount of money that's going to these individuals is slowly rising, and the amount of money that is going to the rest of staff at the university is falling. And these are very small effects because we're talking about a very large budget, and 50 or 100 people don't shift it enormously, but they are significant effects. So when we say that it is possible for employers to make a different decision on pay and also on working conditions, the response can't be that they don't have the money to do it, because A, the money is there, B, the way that you strategically choose to spend money is a choice. And there are different strategic investments that can be made. And for a sector where staff and students and education and research are the fundamental core business activities, any financial model which doesn't prioritize this group is inexplicable and unconscionable. So I kind of wanted to end, I wanted to show you something that I've put together, which, let's see if I can do this. I've put together a figure. Okay, share screen. There we go. I hope that you all can see this. I took a look at your grade spine, the way it plays out. And what I've done here is I have taken 4 different hypothetical starters at the OU, and I've chosen sort of academic grade 1 and grade 6 here. I've also got charts for grade 7 and academic grade 2 and academic grade 3 and grade 8. In all cases, these are the same points on the pay spine. So what you can see here is and I've adjusted using RPI these into real terms adjusted it to 2021 equivalency, because we don't have all of the data yet for 2022, but I think that 2022 will have an enormous impact on this graph in a negative way. And the important thing to see though is that if you look at someone who started in just 2008, so that's not actually that long ago, somebody who started in just 2013, so just 5 years later, by this year, what they are making in real terms has only just caught up with the starting salary of someone who was hired in 2008. When you look at the person who was hired in 2021, and I really want everyone in this room to think of colleagues who you know who started in 2021 or grad students you have who might be entering the sector this year or next year. The trajectory that that employee is on, that person who started in 2021, if the offers that we get from UCEA continue to be below inflation in the way that they have been for the past 20 years, this person will never in their entire career catch up to the starting salary of someone hired in 2008. That's how far our sector has fallen in just the time period between 2008 and 2021. This is unsustainable, and that at its core is what this dispute is about taking the same stand that we took in 2018 to say, no, you cannot take away our defined benefit pensions, and to say, no, you cannot keep eroding our pay. You must invest in staff and students that and take any questions that anyone has.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, it's amazing to see the table that you've produced and have that kind of bring to life what a loss of at least 25% of our pay over that time actually means. It's just tremendous. And also, if you've got a few extra charts, we would absolutely love to have them if you wouldn't mind, so we can share those. Can I just see if there anybody has a hand up to ask Robyn questions or put something in the chat pane and we'll pick it up. Okay, so while we're waiting to see if there are other questions, I had one which is specifically about the pay gaps. So here at the Open University, we had what was originally not a very big gender pay gap, but it's getting worse and worse, unfortunately. At the same time, last year was the very first time the universities published the race and ethnicity pay gap, which was just absolutely astonishingly bad. Up there, I think, with some of the almost the worst of the Russell Group universities. So can you tell us a little bit more about how the framework that UCU was arguing for would actually help to address that sector-wide problem?
Yes, absolutely, I can. And I have a horrifying and sneaking suspicion about why the pay gap for gender has gotten worse at OU and other institutions as well, which I'll come into in this answer. So one thing that we see is that universities' employers are willing to publish their pay gap data, and in fact, they're legally mandated to do so. But what and they're willing to start EDI groups to sort of discuss the fact that this is all a big problem and that these problems exist. What we're not seeing, though, from most institutions, I will say there are a couple of exceptions, but from most institutions, is a concrete action plan to address the underlying causes of gender pay gaps, race pay gaps, and disability pay gaps. And enough research has been done, particularly on gender pay gaps, but we're getting more and more research on ethnicity, race, and disability pay gaps to give us a sense of what's causing these at their core. And what we need is action plans to address this. So, for example, one of the huge drivers of gender pay gap inequality and race pay gap is, and disability, actually, all of them, is promotions inequalities. If you are a white, cisgendered, able-bodied male, you are more likely to get promoted in an academic setting than, no matter what your job type is, than any other group of person. A plan that actually tries to address this and is actioned would go a long way towards beginning to close these pay gaps. What we don't want is for universities to just agree, oh, okay, by 2024, we'll close the gender pay gap, but with no plan for how to do so. What we do want, and this is that framework that I was talking about, is to get every employer to agree to have an action plan that is published where they work with the local trade union to action it. And then the data on that then feeds back into the central Jinch's negotiating so that then we can go through, okay, do we need to edit this baseline standard? Do we need to add more baseline standards? How are we going to collectively improve this sector? But that part where the local unions negotiate it with their employer is really important, because I can see in the chat, I can't read the whole plan, but yeah, so some universities do have strong action plans, and we want these baseline standards to recognize the places where individual universities are doing well, but bring the sector as a whole up to those levels. So my university is doing okay on gender pay, for example, but the race and disability pay gaps are absolutely shocking. So I think you can find each university is doing okay in some of these working conditions areas, but not all of them. And that's what this framework and baseline standards are meant to address.
Oh, that's really helpful, because as you know, we've had a lot of success with anti-casualization, and that we've got a new AL contract, 4,800 or so ALs. It has in practice been extremely difficult to implement, and is really tough for both the associate lecturers and their managers, the staff tutors at the moment. But nevertheless, we're all very pleased at the push that the university's made to do that, and I think it's something that we would definitely praise the management for committing to it. And alongside that, as has been said in the chat, there's been a lot of commitment to improving EDI issues too. But where we're really falling down at the moment is workload. The sense that the universities had report after report, some of them commissioned by themselves, which shows that we've got a workload crisis, and yet there doesn't seem to be an answer to that. And I wonder if, again, you could say a little bit more about how these frameworks might actually help to address and force universities to face up to workload crises.
Yes, absolutely. So if I can abuse the fact that I'm currently speaking to say something about your previous point as well, and this relates to workload. So first of all, huge congratulations. I mean, it's been a decade of work that you guys put into this huge victory for job security. And you mentioned that it's been difficult to implement, and that's always going to be true. And there's always going to be sort of devils in the detail of implementation. And actually, even for universities which have had victories like this, having this sort of framework of baseline standards in place that I'm talking about can only benefit because it helps the unions be able to point to something and say, look, yes, you agreed this with us, but here's this standard, you need to meet it, and you're going to be held accountable not just by us locally, but also at a UK-wide level to achieving these things. And this data is going to be going back. And the reason this relates to workload is because we actually had what I would have considered a fairly substantial victory at my institution over workload. We had a one-year academic workload working group, which was meant to then transition into a professional services staff workload working group, that came out with a 14-page document that I think was pretty revolutionary in what it was proposing to happen to our workload modeling at Sheffield, and also the way that tariffs for that workload modeling were done, and that put in sort of a 5% sort of ceiling for you could only workload someone to 95%. It had to be measured in hours, it had to include this, it had to include that, had to include consultation. Getting this implemented over the past 3 years has been remarkably difficult. And every single day, I wish I could point to these sector-wide baseline standards to sort of say, no, you have to do this. But what I just described, so some of the things I just listed are some of the things that would help with a workload crisis if we could get them implemented sector-wide. Things like workload has to be measured in hours. Things like workers have to be allowed to have a workload model to point to. I know workload models aren't perfect. Definitely the tariffs inherent in them can increase problems or can cause problems if the tariffs are wrong. But if you're a worker and you don't have a workload model, you don't have anything to point to argue that you're overworkloaded. So having this workload model can actually really help us to advocate for people, both in casework and for members to self-advocate. But that's got to be measured in hours. It's got to include all work. It has to have some sort of healthy overhead, and a worker has to be capped. If you've been given enough work that it hits your yearly hours, there has to be the principle that you can't be given more work. And that is one of the fundamental things we're fighting for with this framework.
Thank you so much for that. I've got Leslie who would like to come in with a question. Leslie?
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that, Robyn. I think your point about not missing things out of people's workload is very salient at the moment, because we're currently, we always knew it was going to be difficult, because we're setting the precedents at the moment for how the new AL contract is going to work. And a great many of those precedents actually have to do with workload and what we can be expected to do. And yet we keep on coming over this, oh, you know, we're not going to give you any hours for that. You know, we just expect you to do it as part of the job now. But the other thing I would actually like to ask about the workload norms. And I think, you know, transparent workload norms are very important, that you know, that people can understand. But I would like to ask, how do you deal with the situation where they become unrealistic? I mean, there has to be some kind of feedback loop, a reality check, if you like, where people can feed in how long they actually took to do these various bits and pieces, because that's a problem that we have here over and over again. If people will bear with me for another 30 seconds or so, you know, the history of associate lecturer workload, which is basically an itemized system and estimates for how long we, like, you know, inherited from hourly paid systems, how long we spend marking assignments, how long we spend doing this and that. Whereas for other staff, academic and related staff, it's supposed to be based on what a full-time job, you know, what does a full-time job look like? In the distant past, it might have been a more realistic version of what a full-time job looks like. But actually, we've all ended up in the same place. They're two very different systems, but we've all ended up doing about 30% more than we should be doing, you know, according to our various workload surveys, which in turn is not that different from what UCU says about the sector. So I do sometimes become a bit cynical and think, well, actually, what's really going on under the surface is something different. It's actually got more to do with how far you can push people and still have a workforce, or how far you can push people until they start becoming ill. But, you know, that might be a very cynical view. I'll finish there because I'm taking up too much time. Thank you.
I mean, I 100% agree, Leslie. It's one of the fundamental issues is how you calculate, you know, how much time a task is meant to take. I think the sort of short answer to this is that because there are what we would be fighting for here would be something that would impact every single worker in higher education. So going beyond UCU members, going into every single job type. And an adequate discussion of that, if those of us involved in Jinches tried to come up with a list of appropriate tariffs, we would get it wrong. There's no question. I could spend, you know, I could make it a full-time job to try to mark out workload tariffs for every job in this sector, and I wouldn't get it right because there are too many types of jobs. There are too many individual circumstances, institution by institution. And this is actually where what we're fighting for is something that builds in that local negotiation stage. So imagine that we were able to get a sector-wide commitment to having workload models that were measured in hours and a commitment to include all work. This is basically us agreeing to then have the discussion locally and negotiate over it locally with you know, hopefully at this point, the thing that UCU could do to help its members would be to have every single branch doing this negotiating at the same time with coordinated efforts and support from regional offices, from HQ, from the negotiating team, because we would actually be in a position to be able to say, here's what was agreed, here's some guidelines for what you could go for, let's maybe schedule almost like a branch delegate meeting, but not of the sort that we normally have to decide, you know, what type of action, but I like feedback in how this is going, how can we share experiences, because then we wouldn't be reinventing the wheel, all of us. We'd be all simultaneously trying to create a similar wheel, but taking into account our own individual institutions' idiosyncrasies and the idiosyncrasies of each job. Also, just to say, I don't think you're being cynical. I think that in any, when you have a business that involves equipment, for example, there is a kind of sad incentive in capitalism to use that equipment until it wears out, especially if you can get cheap new equipment. And one of the things that maybe this is cynical, that I worry and feel has happened in higher education is the increasing perspective that humans are equipment and that humans should be treated like a resource to get as much as you can out of us, as opposed to a resource that you invest in, because when you invest in something, you get more out of it. And maybe that is cynical, but I agree with you that that's what's happening.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but it's it's been so encouraging to hear you talk about the breadth of this pay claim, the fact that it includes so much, and also to illustrate, just how much we have to win in terms of improved conditions. And I think I've heard you say previously, this isn't the moon on the stick. This is just about setting absolutely standard, baseline norms for improving our sector. So thank you so much for that. Thank you again to Mark. And we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid.
Thank you so much.